Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for choosing to join us for the next 60 minutes or so to explore some of the challenges and solutions around the implementation of the ICAO global reporting format. We'll be focusing on the implementation of GRF for airports that are not affected by winter operations during this webinar. This is a significant change that the entire aviation industry will be undergoing on the 4th of November. At the latest. Some of the EASA states and Canada are changing over already on the 12th of August, and the US has already implemented a TAPA ARC, which is a form of the GRF. My name is Thomas Romig. I'm Vice President, Safety, Security and Operations here at ACI in Montreal. I joined the organization in November last year after 12 years of leadership roles in safety and operations at Geneva Airport. I'd like to start by thanking our sponsor today, Moventor, for providing support to ACI and enabling us to develop a strong promotional campaign to assist airports and the industry in the implementation of efforts. I'm also joined today by an excellent panel of experts with a wealth of experience in the domain, and we'll be hearing from them in just a moment. They will really be sharing their experience and knowledge on the topic of GRF and the implementation for non-winter conditions as we go along through this session. Before we get started, just a couple of words about Airports Council International. ACI is the trade association of the world's airports. It was founded in 1991, and ACI represents the best interests of airports during key phases of policy development, with the objective of ensuring a global air transport system that's safe, secure, customer-centric, and environmentally sustainable. As of January 2021, our organization serves 701 members, operating 1,933 airports in 183 countries, a truly global organization, which represents overall 96% of the global passenger traffic. Now, to come to the topic of the day, the implementation of GRF, Global Reporting Format for Runway Assessments, is going to bring, of course, significant improvements to the safety of flight operations by standardizing the way in which information on runway conditions is reported by aerodromes and therefore understood by flight crews. And this is the key element to this change which we're implementing. However, as with any significant change, there's a number of unique challenges which the industry is faced with. And to assist the airport community with this implementation, from an airport side, ACI has developed a promotion and awareness campaign, including a number of communications and tools, and this webinar being one of those communications. We are holding the second of two webinars on the subject, focusing on aerodromes that aren't directly affected by winter operations, as the challenges, I would say, are slightly different than those for winter operations. We had a first webinar on winter operations on the 15th of April, and you can view that webinar again if need be on the ACI website. The recording of this webinar will be available in 24 hours on our website also. So one of the challenges we've identified is how to do visual inspections of a runway and measure contaminants like standing water. And as you can see on the picture here, we have some pools of standing water. We'll be talking more about this over the next hour, and currently working with ICAO on developing some guidance material on this topic. So these are again some of the tools which we're trying to provide to you. So today's session is going to work around identifying challenges and solutions for the implementation, to help airport operators in the implementation of GRF. We have to bear in mind that obviously not all airports are fully ready. And in the results of a survey that we conducted in April, we found that only about, well, maybe not only, but about 70% of respondents to the survey had started the implementation process. They have a plan and are in the process of implementing. However, very few were fully ready for the switchover. And so this session here is going to try and focus on some of the challenges that we have identified, as well as the solutions, obviously, around change management, the safety assessment processes which are necessary for the changes. So integrating the change into the safety management process of the organization, planning and training, of course, two important aspects. Tools and systems, and what has been used and what types of approaches are taken towards these. Physical observations, as previously mentioned, and an important point, coordination with stakeholders across the airport platforms and on a community level, which is very important to look into. So these are the points we'll be addressing. Please feel free to drop any questions that you may have in the chat box, and I'll see how I can weave these into the discussion as we go along through the session today. The approach that we're going to have for this webinar is going to be a fairly open and dynamic discussion. We have a couple of slides up front to set the scene, and then we will have a panel discussion with our experts just to look at some of the challenges and some of the solutions which we've identified. So moving on to the content of the day, I'd now like to welcome our panelists, a truly global group of experts. We have Ian Witter, who for many years was with the BAA, British Airports Authority, and then London Heathrow Airports, and Ian has been ACI's representative on the ICAO friction task force since the discussions began on the topic, more or less. So Ian will be able to answer pretty much any of the tricky questions which we have from a technical perspective. I have also with us today Charles Adu Hansen, Group Executive for Airports from the Ghana Airports Company in Accra. Charles is also the Vice Chair of the ACI Safety Technical Standing Committee. We have Kiatai Yeo, who is the Managing Director of Airport Operations for the Changi Airport Group in Singapore, live from Singapore. And we have Marcio Saguer, who's Operations Manager, joining us from south of here in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. So I'd like to welcome all of the panelists and thank you all again for taking time to participate and be here and share your experience with us over the next 60 minutes. I'm now going to hand over to Ian Witter, who is going to give us an overview of the what GRF is all about in just a few slides to set the scene and let us understand where we're going. Ian, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Thomas. Yes, hello everyone, welcome. Just an introductory session then about GRF and how we got here through the work of ICAO. Next slide, please, Tom. So a bit of background. Actually, this all began with a focus on runway excursions. Runway excursions are one of the top 5 risks identified by a number of regulators, and particularly ICAO and EASA. When you look at runway excursions, there are in fact more of those than there are incursions. There's a lot of focus on incursions, but actually the greater number of events are runway excursions. I was part of a Eurocontrol study group a number of years ago looking at runway excursions, and in the study that was done, it was found that most excursions actually happen on rainy runways, wet runways with water. So some people think GRF is only for winter, but actually the majority, if you like, of the problem of preventing excursions happens in rain. The reason that is about the depth of water and aquaplaning. The tires don't grip, we don't need to go any more into that. The photograph on the left is the what started it all, really, particularly for the Talper system in the FAA that was mentioned earlier by Thomas. It was a fatal accident, and really it found that the holes in the Swiss cheese were too big and too many. There were a number of things that didn't work well. So the FAA began the Talper process. ICAO established the friction task force because it was recognized that actually across many different countries, they had all invented their own methods of dealing with friction, of aircraft stopping. And in fact, one of the pilots on the friction task force complained he needed a library in the cockpit of all the different countries he flew to and the different ways they dealt with friction. So it was agreed there should be one way forward. Next slide, please, Tom. So the friction task force was invented. I think it was back in something like 2008 it started. I wasn't there then, but I've been through the latter half of the meetings, and it's a wide-ranging group. Airports were in there. I was the representative, as I say, for ACI. A number of airlines, IATA, regulators from many countries, and importantly, I'd pick out Boeing and Airbus. This is all an aircraft performance issue. This is all trying to find a way of calculating how aircraft perform on the runway. So very important part of all this. There were many meetings. The output of the work was done through the ICAO Aerodrome Design and Operations Panel, and it went through a consultation and review and state letter before it found itself published back in 2016 in PANS Aerodromes. The picture you've got there is the latest edition, the third edition 2020. That's where all the detail of GRF is published in ICAO. The plan was to actually implement this a year ago, but very unusually for ICAO, it was agreed to delay it for a year because of really the training need for both pilots, for airports, for ATC, everybody involved. So it was delayed a year, and now it's coming towards us this November 2021. Next slide, please, Tom. So the focus for the non-winter airports, it's about water. So this, I should stress, this is not a training course, this slide. This is just an introduction for those of you perhaps not so familiar. On the right-hand side, I have what's known as the RCAM, the Runway Condition Assessment Matrix, and the runway condition codes are these 0 to 6 down the left-hand side of the column. The only options to do with water are, well, you can have a dry runway, that's code 6. You can have a wet runway, normally just wet, up to 3 millimeters deep would be a code 5. And if it's more than 3 millimeters deep, that's called standing water, and that would be a code 2. The code 3 applies if you have part of your runway with, let's say, rubber deposit or relatively poor friction, which you would know from your assessments of runway friction assessments using your CFME. If you're below the minimum friction level when it's wet, then that third would be a code 3 if you have more than 100 meters length of that runway below your minimum friction level established by the state in your country. So those are the 3 categories. It is much simpler than the winter situation, so I thought it was worth just highlighting what it consists of. So that's how the runway condition codes will be made in non-winter airports. The output of the code is made either via ATIS to your ATC, or possibly via your ATC read out over the RT to pilots. And a SNOTAM is needed to report it, not in the case of the code 5s where it's just normally wet, but if you've got a 3 or a 2 in the report, then it needs to be reported through the SNOTAM. An example on the bottom is just what the whole code would look like. This is taken from some of the ACI training material. I won't go through all the coding. You can see it on the screen, but the 3 codes are there, 222, because in this example, there's 100% of 5 millimeters, which makes it standing water all over the runway. So that's a snapshot really of what's involved for non-winter airports, and a bit of the background as to how we got here how ICAO has made one of the biggest changes actually in introducing this over many years. It's touched lots of the industry. It is a big change. And now we're getting close to the implementation in November. So that's the introduction. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you very much, Ian. And I can see in our chat here, we already have quite a few questions that are coming in. I'll start with just one very an initial question, I'd say more technical one that you may be able to answer while we have this image of the RCAM up here. So the question is, can the runway condition code, or in let's say non-winter operations, is the runway condition codes or the runway condition codes 4, 1 and 0 used, generally speaking? You've highlighted 5, 3 and 2 here for wet. Would the other ones be used, and would we still have the downgraded or can that downgrade from 5 to 4, for example, be used in non-winter operations, if that makes any sense?
That's a good question. I think the answer is no, you wouldn't use the others. You would. The only ways of reporting water are on those 3 highlighted. I don't think the others, that wasn't the intention of the other things that were mentioned there. They're more to deal with winter conditions.
That was my understanding also, so thanks for the clarification. I think it's important to point out that the ones which are indeed focused on wet are 5, 3 and 2, and not necessarily the other ones. So I guess the subsequent question to that is the downgrading mechanism, downgrading or upgrading mechanism applicable with in wet conditions? And maybe I don't know, Ian, if you have an opinion on that, or any of the other panelists. And once we've covered that very, I'd say, more of a technical challenge in the beginning, we'll go into some of the other topics which we've identified for today.
I don't think it is. I don't think it is applicable. I think, as I say, those are the 3 categories. You wouldn't vary from those. They cover all the situations depending on the depth and the water that you have. So I don't see the relevance. The upgrade downgrade was meant for special severe winter conditions, when a runway assessor may have a view that he doesn't quite like the answer he's getting, and it's really a very small number of cases that would be applicable, and that's in extreme winter. So I don't think it is appropriate for wet.
Okay, thanks, Ian. So just to let you know, we have now 499 participants online, so welcome to you all. We have the chat function which is available. You're more than welcome to put questions in as we go along. We may not be able to answer specifically each of the questions, but we will gather all of them following the session and be able to provide feedback if necessary following the session that we have today. So again, thank you all for participating. Well, we're actually now at full capacity, 501 participants. So I would just like to shift into, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can see everybody. In principle, that should be now done. And I'd like to now open up the discussion with the 4 of you on some of the topics which we've identified, and starting with the change management. This is obviously, as we explained in the introduction, a significant change for airports, a significant change for the overall aviation system, I would say. Pilots, ATC, airports are all involved, manufacturers too. From an airport's perspective, what change management processes have you applied internally to ensure the safe transition to GRF? Or you may be in the process of applying them, but what has been the strategy which you've taken? And I'd like you to focus a little bit on the aspects around safety management systems. Maybe Kietai, from Changi's perspective, you can give us your overview, and then I'll go to Marcio and Charles on this one.
Sure, Tom. I'm glad to start this. I think for Singapore, for a tropical country, because if even though Singapore it's hot, clearly no snow, and I think one of the things that we first grappled with was what was this about? I know Ian said that around the world, runway excursion happens a lot more than runway incursions. But in Singapore Changi Airport, actually, it's the opposite. We have had quite few runway excursions over the years. Our main concern has been always runway incursions. So the challenge for us was first to grapple with, okay, what was this about? That took some understanding, and it was there are multiple stakeholders at the airport we have to work with to reach that common understanding. It's not just the airport operator, it's also our ANSP, also the airlines. And after we getting that alignment, is identifying the key stakeholders who will be involved in the implementation. So definitely from the airport operator viewpoint, there's ourselves, ANSP, the pilots, the airlines. Next, then also after going through the stakeholders, after identifying them, would be how will we govern this whole change? And we have a fairly robust governance structure of safety committees, both internally to within the airport organization, but as well as externally with all the different stakeholders. So there's a series of different discussions that happen to work out what the proposals might be. And after zooming in onto the approach that we'll take at Singapore Changi Airport, then it's about doing the risk assessment, what identify hazards, how will we mitigate hazards, how we train the people, who should we train, and how much time we need. So that's roughly the process we're in, and I think we're now at the tail end of the implementation.
Thanks, Kitai. Marcio, from your perspective in the management of change?
Well, here in Brazil, I would say that we are right in the middle. In Rio de Janeiro, we are right in the middle of the implementation. So what we are facing now is to understand the regulation. Actually, we don't have yet the right regulation, but we do have ANAC issue the guidance of the GRF implementation for the Brazil. So even though that we don't have the regulation, we already have the guidance to do the implementation. So regarding that, we use the runway safety team because we already have all the stakeholders at the same meeting to do this conversation and to do the planning and how we're gonna do the implementation for the airport. So one of the challenges is to understand exactly what the expectation for our regulatory for our CAA, from Civil Aviation Authority, because once that you don't have the regulation to provide you the source, some of the stakeholders, for example, our ATC, won't follow all the procedures. So what we have done here, we're making a letter of agreement with all stakeholders, including the airline, the civil authority, the airports, to do the implementation. ANAC did the first implementation with Curitiba Airport, and after that, we are doing our implementation in Rio de Janeiro. So the challenge was to put everybody on the same room to do the conversation and to start the implementation, even though you don't have all the documentation.
Excellent, and I think that's a very important point, is the coordination with stakeholders, and we'll certainly be talking more to that specific element. Charles, from your perspective in Ghana, have you had how have you integrated this change with your safety management procedures?
I mean, currently the documentation from the CAA is not yet ready. The advisory circulars are now being merged into their system. But what we've done is to try and identify the entire cycle of agencies that have to be involved. And like you just said, the runway safety team is one forum where that is done. The challenges that we've had so far is trying to get the local pilots to also be part of the loop. because most of our operations are international, and you do have just a few domestic operations, and then we're trying to get them all involved in that cycle. But the change management is currently going on, and there's been a lot of inter-agency meetings and to work together to try and understand what GRF is bringing onto us. And currently, I would say that it's being managed properly, because now we have all the cycle into various meetings that are scheduled, and also there are a lot of classes going on, workshops going on for all the agencies to understand what this is bringing to us and whose role is what. It's all being discussed. So I think to a large extent, the teams have come together and working together to achieve the aim that we are looking for.
Thanks, Charles. I think you mentioned a very important point, is the runway safety team, the local runway safety team. And this is clearly one of the best teams, or one of the best forums in which we will be able to share information across the airport platform. Just wondering, Ian, if there's anything you wanted to add to this particular point in terms of information sharing, safety management procedures, from your experience through numerous years of safety management in the British airports?
I think I would just add that it needs to go through a change management process and understand it. I think, as Charles was just explaining, happens. Another point may be the state regulator might be thinking along the same lines of orchestrating some sort of national implementation, in which case it's important to be involved with them, and so you're kind of in step and all on the same page on what's involved. And then it's just regular communication with the stakeholders involved, which is your ANSP and perhaps the Aeronautical Information Service for getting out SNOTAMs or ATIS. So I think those are the main stakeholders, and they would be the right people to be involved in a change management process.
Thanks, and I think that's absolutely right. Is ensuring that the change is well coordinated across the airport community is key. Part of this change, of course, is training, and making sure that all staff who are affected by the change are trained. From ACI's side, we provide a web-based training module, as well as a virtual course, which can be made available. Ian is actually one of our instructors for that course. So if there's any interest in some training, that's still possible, let's say from an institutional side. But there's of course an important aspect to this training, which is the on-the-job and in the field training. And I'd like to get a feel from you guys, from the airport's perspective, how you've gone around this training, and in particular the challenges that you may have faced related to the COVID restrictions. Doing face-to-face training in these circumstances are obviously fairly complex, and I know something a lot of airports are currently facing and finding a bit challenging. So maybe I'll start with Marcio, if you can give us a perspective from Brazil on that.
Sure. Well, talking about the training, definitely COVID had a tremendous impact on this project. Our staff, we still have impact with the COVID. We're still working on a contingency plan, which means that we don't have all the staff at the airport. We are working on the minimum staff. So to do the training, we haven't had much experience in the web-based training for our frontline team. So we step up. We were able to put this training, the theoretical training, but we still have to do the on-job training. So right now we are doing exactly we are at this phase. We have provided training to our frontline team, especially for the airport. We help our ATC to do this online training as well. So we split the phases of this training, of this implementation, in 3 phases. The first phase is do the training with our airside officers. After that, doing the training with our ATC officers. And then after we completed these good communication and make sure that both teams understand how the process will follow, we are going to involve the pilots on this phase. So we're gonna complete the whole circle. So definitely, COVID, it's a tremendous impact for us.
Thanks, and I think that's, again, in your training cycle, you have all of the stakeholders involved, which is really, really important. Charles, any perspective from your side? You need to unmute, Charles. Always a challenge with the virtual world. You're good to go, Charles. We can hear you.
Okay, so what I'm saying is that what we've done in Ghana is to break the classes into smaller groups, and we stretch it over a period of time so that we can accommodate them with the necessary COVID protocols. So that is being done, and our main plan here is we should be able to cover everybody and all the cycle way before 3 months before implementation date, because we want to do a test run and run the test on our airports as a training section before we get to the implementation date. So, but what we've done to manage the COVID is to break the classes into smaller groups and then have them with the necessary spacing that we need to have in the class. But that's the plan we're using.
Excellent, thanks for that. And maybe just to finish up on the training side, Kietai.
Yeah, I mean, certainly COVID has had an impact, but also, I would say training, there are 2 aspects to it. One was trying to understand GRF regulation in the first place. Thankfully, all that happened before COVID hit us, so we had the opportunity to participate in the conferences organized by ICAO and ACI. We also had ACI come over to give us on-site training, so that was very useful. Then comes the actual implementation. What exactly is the approach we took? And we need to train our guys in the SOPs. And that one, we had some delays because we adopted the modeling approach and we needed to bring in equipment for installation. COVID actually delayed some of these implementation. So we had to wait until the equipment are installed, integrated with the NSP before we could start some of these training. But during the COVID period, Singapore went through what we call a circuit breaker. It's some sort of a period where a lot of people had to work from home, so that also made the training more complicated. So that was some of the challenges we faced, but I think we are at the tail end now, just waiting to do some dry runs and really bring in the different stakeholders to see whether or not the SOPs are well oiled, and whether there are any blind spots that we need to be mindful of. Thank you.
So I really like the approach of doing the training and then doing a dry run. I think that's a very important lessons learned that we can retain, is once the training has been done, making sure that there are some dry runs which are done prior to implementation to make sure that the staff who have been trained up are fully aware and competent. So that's, I would say, definitely something to keep in mind. I'd like to move to the more practical measurement of contaminants. And in this case, we're talking about water. There's a lot of questions in the chat which are coming in around how do we measure water and how often do we measure water? If we have persistent rain across the airport, sometimes, and all of you are affected by tropical type of rain, which can be very strong and short, or can be sort of spaced out and more persistent. So how have you addressed that particular point? And maybe before we go to that, I'll just ask Ian a technical question. There's a question coming to us from India saying we have hailstorms where there can be significant amounts of hail which coat the runway, would we report, or what type of contaminant would we report? Would it be wet ice? Because technically that is one of the contaminants that can be reported. I can't remember the code, but how would you interpret that from the RCAM, Mr. Waiter?
Now, this question has come up before. It's not included specifically in the contaminants in the GRF. So I took the question back to the task force some years ago, and the answer was, well, it is ice. So you have ice on your runway. It's not the sort of ice that you might have in a winter condition, but it is still ice and it's very slippery. So therefore you should treat it, report it, preferably remove it or hope it will thaw soon. But if you have it present and you're open, the answer I was given was it is ice.
All right, thanks for that. It's that's an interesting one because we are indeed faced with those types of conditions at various times. So just coming back to the question of measurement and what approach you've taken towards that. Maybe I'll start with you, Charles, in Ghana. How you know with the tropical type of rain that you get, how have you been able to manage that particular situation?
This is one of the main things that we've been discussing in all our training. Basically, you can have different intensities in a tropical rainstorm, which means that you have different downpours in between times. And one of the things we are discussing is when there's a change in the condition, we will still have to get onto the runway and check it out and report it. And this is one of the things that we are working on. So the understanding is that once there's a change in the intensity of the rain, we would have to get the new measurements and let pilots know what the code is. But the other point that I wanted to bring, and I spoke to Ian about it, is in Africa, you have some conditions where people have mud on their runways following major downpours. And I know that we don't currently have it, considered in the scheme of things, but it is one of the issues that happen in Africa in some runways that after a heavy downpour, you have mud coming onto the runway. So that's one of the things that we need to discuss somewhere down the lane when GRF gets going. I don't know whether Ian, you want to have a comment on that?
Yeah, Charles, just to repeat really our conversation, yeah, it's not in the criteria again. The reason some of these are not in is because it's all to do with aircraft performance, and Boeing and Airbus have measured aircraft performance, stopping performance, takeoff performance in all these different contaminants that are listed, but they don't have the data for hail and they don't have the data for mud. So that's why they don't appear. My suggestion to you, Charles, it's only an informal one, was you treat it as water. It's a depth of water. That's the closest. If I think the other point was you might discuss it with some of your local pilots who've experienced it and see what their view is. Yeah. But there'll need to be a way of dealing with it. Again, maybe a national regulator might get involved in that. If it's a common problem, it would be sensible if it's dealt with in a common way across the country or an area and not individually airport by airport. But you're quite right, it's something that's not specifically dealt with by the GRF for the reasons of the performance information.
And it can probably be something that that there will be lessons learned coming out of the implementation on the 4th of November, and there's a follow-up scheme which is planned by ICAO, and these types of elements which haven't been identified will certainly be elevated and brought back to the Friction Task Force for review. So it would be interesting also to bring this up, but we've been made aware of it, Charles. So I think we'll make sure we follow up on that. Still staying on the measurement processes for standing water, for water on the runway. Maybe I'll go to Kietai on this one.
Yep. Well, as I mentioned just now, in Singapore Changi Airport, we adopted a modeling approach, and that first of all, it relates to the tropical weather we have. We can have very sudden downpours, very frequent downpours. And the intensity of rain makes it such that by the time the rain happens and you get out to measure it, it may be a delayed response. That's one. Two, in addition to the rain, we often have thunderstorms, so it's very lightning prone. half the days of the year, we are subject to lightning strikes. So having somebody go in the runway, our vehicle, to make a physical measurement does entail some risk. So something that we wanted to address. 3, if you go in a vehicle to go on the runway to take some measurements, that means to close the runway for some time. And what we were desiring was to minimize runway downtime. So in the end, we adopted a modern approach where we have rain sensors to measure the rain that's coming down. We have a system that then models it to tell us how much, what's the water depth on the runway. So that's the approach we took, and also helps that we have a groove runway. So water does run off fairly easily. That's why earlier in the webinar, I did mention that we had some delays in the training aspects because some of this equipment that we were supposed to get in had some delays.
It's a very interesting approach, having the modeling, and I'm assuming you're going to get some visitors to Singapore to come and look at what you're doing on that at some point.
I'm happy to do that as long as the COVID rules allow for it.
Excellent. Thanks. I think it's a very interesting point. We'll come back very quickly to the tools and methodologies in just a moment. Marcio, from your perspective, also with sometimes fairly important tropical type of rains, how do you deal with that?
Well, pretty much the same as Charlie said. We do the runway inspection since we have a weather change. So we do basically when it starts raining, if it's a light raining, we will go on only once. But if it's a continued raining, we will be ready until to our ATC callers, called the airside officers, and then we will perform the runway inspection. In our case, as you mentioned that we're going to talk a little bit about the tools, we have a water measurement with a sensor. It's a vehicle equipped with the sensor, so we don't have to go to drop off the car and go outside, do the measurement. So it's a continuous measurement. So in our case, we just go inside the runway, do the measurement, and leave, and then we'll be set. We'll be ready to let the ATC know the code.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And so speaking of letting ATC or informing ATC, there's an interesting question, and Ian, you may be able to address this, is why do we use the SNOTAM when it may be confusing, for pilots, particularly who don't necessarily have a SNOTAM or are not used to receiving SNOTAMs in environments where there isn't snow, to suddenly see this. So maybe from the FTF Friction Task Force perspective, you can add something on that.
It was just recognized that there needs to be a report that needs to go out in the communication system, both to the flight deck and to the airline offices, dispatch office, flight planning, etc. And what it was really, I think, was left to ICAO and the Aeronautical Information Service, and they said we already have a system like this that's called the SNOTAM. So they didn't want to change it, didn't want to change the name or come up with some new additional category. So it was as simple as that, and that's why we've got what we've got. There's no greater reason.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think it's something which I'm assuming will also be discussed as part of the lessons learned coming out of the implementation, the potential confusion that we have there. Sticking with the topic of coordination with ATC, there's a few questions which we're receiving in terms of how do you transmit the information from the runway inspectors to ATC and then up to flight crews, basically. Have there been any tools which have been implemented or methodologies which have been implemented specific to that in your airport environments? It's obviously one of the key aspects of the reporting. So maybe I'll start again with Kietai from your side in Changi. How have you addressed that?
Well, as mentioned just now, we adopted modeling approach, which means that we had a system that will calculate and tell us what's the water depth on the runway. Attached to it is also we then connected ourselves to the ATC system, which well, they do both air traffic control as well as AIS service. So for us, the main approach is to transmit the information electronically to ATC, into AIS.
Yeah, that's probably the easiest if you have the means to do that. There's probably, and some of the questions I've seen here are related to the use of VHF or other means to do that transmission. Charles, have you implemented a system in Ghana for this, or are you using more manual techniques?
There's a whole debate going on currently with the stakeholders to just try and figure out which would be the best way of communicating. I mean, in the past, these are VHF radios, so is what they are using. The question now is if it comes to the frequency with which you would have to, report this if you have a tropical storm, how is this going to be, delivered? So as part of the stakeholders engagement, this is currently being discussed, looking at different options, and we are looking for practical options. It should be practical options where if you depend too much on technology and it fails you in a storm, what do you do? So this is an ongoing thing. It's one of the major things that we are trying to figure out the best options that we use.
And there are a number of different tools which are available across the market to do this electronic transmission of data to ATC. Of course, you have to have backup procedures which will allow you to be able to do that in case the tool itself doesn't work. We addressed this actually fairly extensively in the first webinar we did on the 15th of April. And so for any viewers who would like to know more about some of the tools available, please go to the ACI website and you can view the webinar that we had on the 15th of April on GRF for winter operations. But those tools are also applicable for reporting and communication in non-winter operation conditions. Marcio, have you implemented a system in Rio, or are you using also manual techniques, or what's the approach that you've taken there?
Yeah, actually, we have two methodology. One is the manual, in case of our electronic device doesn't work. What have we done here? It's as soon as we completed the runway inspection, we'll let the ATC know the runway conditions code, like 555. After that, we agreed that the airside officers will input the whole information, the RCR information, into the website for Brazilian website. We agree as well also with ATC that they will put the information, this runway condition code, into their TIS. So what we have done here is that we understood that we are not going to have a lot of change of the code. Probably we will still stick with 5. We will be working on 6 in dry and in 5. It will not be common to go under 5, only in case of some issues regarding the maintenance. And what we have done here, we did a stud with this data that we collected from this device to make sure how good is our runway. So with this study for almost 2 or 3 years, we didn't have any spot over 3 millimeters. So our methodology will be like something like that. So after the runway inspection, give the code. If there is something wrong with our runway, it should be on the note 10, and then they will apply the right code. Other than that, we'll keep it doing as normal.
Excellent, thanks. Makes a lot of sense. I have an interesting question here which has come up, and and maybe Ian, you can answer this, do the conditions need to be reported even if there are no changes to the conditions? So should we report every day even if it's not raining, for example?
No, you don't need to do that. We had that discussion in the friction task force. The assumption is it's 666. It's assumption the runway is dry. You don't need to do anything. When it gets wet, you start the process, and maybe when it's dry, you issue a last code that's a 666, and then you can stop doing it. When it rains again, you start again. So it's not a continual task. In a dry period of weather in the summer, for example, it's only when it rains you respond to reporting something on the runway.
Excellent. I think that's very clear. Another interesting question, moving a little bit towards stay in the operational perspective, is on an airport where you have more or less continuous arrivals, departures, or if you've got 2 runways and you're doing arrivals and departures on segregated runways, but we have a continuous air traffic flow, yet we have continued rain or precipitation. How do we integrate the runway observation procedure into that traffic flow? What are some best practices we can think of there around doing that and doing it safely to avoid having a runway incursion, which is a question which came up here too. Kietai, you have the solution, I would say, with your modeling. So I won't ask you to go first, but think about what you may have for specific inspections. But maybe Ian, you can give us a little perspective from your time in the British airports around how you get into a very busy runway, for example, Heathrow.
Well, on a general answer, I think the answer is know your runway. Be familiar with your own runway, and if it's raining, you can perhaps be confident that you're only going to report a code 5, like Marcio was saying. He's done the checks for the runway. He's confident if it's raining, it's a 5. So if it's rain everywhere, it's not on one end of the runway, then you can probably say with confidence that it's a 5. If your runway drainage is not very good, if it's not got PFC or it's not grooved or the surface is uneven and you get standing water, then you will need to take more care and assess the areas and the depths of the water. So there's a bit of a balance in there of perhaps not necessarily having to go onto the runway, but you need to be confident, if you don't, that you are making an accurate report. So I wouldn't want to encourage that too much, because it's important if you've got up to 3 millimeters of water or more than 3 millimeters of water. So you need to be confident what you have. If you know your runway and you know maybe where the deepest part of water is, then that's an area you keep an eye on. You might not need to necessarily drive the whole length of the runway, for example. So it will, I think the summary answer is know your runway and always make sure you're making an accurate GRF report.
No, that's excellent, and definitely something also that we can keep in mind is in terms of the training, that the airport ops personnel who are going out and doing the runway inspections should be intimately familiar with the runway layout, with the conditions of that runway, whether there's any areas where there's pooling water, where the drainage challenges or any other specific aspects to that runway, or those multiple runways on larger airports. Charles, has this been a similar approach that you've taken for Accra?
Yes, actually, even just yesterday with one of the sessions we've had, the same issue came up. And the question is that you must be quite intimate with your runway. You must know the runway very well, and you do know from history where your trouble spots are. So basically, even if you can't do the entire length, you know where the trouble spots are, you go there and you check it out. So being intimate with your runway is really part of the GRF thing. You must know your runway very well. And I think this is right spot on there.
And I think, I mean, this also comes to the use of the runway and the runway occupancy time, and whether Finally, having to do these inspections is going to impact your available capacity. This is obviously a challenge which has to be thought about and integrated into the planning. And when you actually go out and do an observation. But if you know that there's specific spots where you have to do your observations, do the checks, then you can probably focus on those rather than having to do the entire runway.
That's right.
Just wondering if Marcio or Kietai, you would like to add anything to that particular point?
Well, I totally agree with Ian and Charles. You have to know your runway. That's the key. Probably you're gonna focus on the touchdown zone, on maybe in the center line, the aiming point, but you gotta know your runway. Otherwise, you're not gonna do a good observation.
Yeah, maybe just to add on, I definitely fully agree with the comment that we need to know the runway. But because we have the good fortune of having a modeling tool that tells us the water level, I think the aspect that we in Singapore will look at is knowing the data. And when we look at the calibration data we had from our equipment, I think it showed that actually even at periods of very heavy rain recently, we've kept well below 3 mm. And if you know the runway well, you know the data well, I think even if the system fails, having experienced a similar rain condition, you can quite confidently know, okay, that's going to be below 3 mm. And in any case, if our system does fail, we also do have a vehicle-mounted laser measuring tool that we can deploy, but that will have to enter the runway for sure.
Excellent. So I think the takeaway for that one is know your runway, go out there, be familiar with it. That's highly important. Just looking at the time, we have just a couple of minutes left. I'd like to come to the point of coordination. We talked about it earlier in terms of community coordination. What would be your recommendation to the listeners that we have here with us today in terms of engagement of the community across for this implementation? Starting quickly with Charles, and then we'll go around.
Okay, I think that the coordination aspect of it from my continent, and especially also some parts of Asia, I just got information from PP as well. Basically the key aspect is to make sure the pilots are part of this coordination. If we don't bring the pilots in to understand how this cycle is supposed to work, then obviously the information to the pilots will not be of any effect. And for pilots in what do you call it, cold winter related countries, is a different matter. But for our continent and where this is not a daily thing, we will need to work very hard to make sure the pilots are part of the coordination and understand everything we're doing. Thank you.
Thanks, Charles. And just for everybody to understand also, this is obviously a coordinated implementation that ICAO is managing, and IATA and IFALPA are very much involved in this. So that's the aircraft operators and the pilots association, and there is a lot of communication and coordination going their way to help with this change. Marcio, would you like to add anything to the local level coordination point?
Sure. Well, I would say that you have to set up a good working group, and also get focused on developing an action plan. Make a list of the changes, like what you have and what you need to change. And don't forget a very good communication plan with your stakeholders is the best way to do a good implementation. And always set a deadline to complete the target. Otherwise, we'll always working around.
End up with a bit of slippage. We want to try and avoid that. We have a deadline, which is the 4th of November, and we want to be ready before that for sure. Kietai?
Yeah, let me just add to that. I think two parts of it. I think it's important to set up a project team involving the key stakeholders. For us, it would be obviously the airborne operator, but the other key stakeholder we had was the ANSP. So it's important to make sure that the key stakeholders are there in the same project team to work out the approach and implementation plan. At the high level, where we have to bring in the pilots, and that's where we have our runway safety team, so that, as Charles pointed out, we can do a lot of stuff, making sure that we have the runway codes out, but in the end, the pilots need to understand what will be published then, so that they know what to do with that. So I think it's a two-level coordination that's important.
Absolutely agree. Ian, any last points you'd like to add on this coordination or any other elements that we've addressed today?
Yeah, just to pick up on a couple of points there. What about the pilots? If the pilots at your airport fly to the USA, they will already be familiar with this because Talpa has been in use for some years. So you might find them useful to bring in to the group or to share their experience because they've already been doing this. So that might help your implementation. The second point I'd add is just there's really two parts to the GRF. There's making the codes, the sort of paperwork, the flow, the formula, and there's going out and doing the assessment. But you can practice both those halves yourselves. You can practice using the codes and the flow charts, just some paperwork, get some familiarity. And equally, when it rains, you could go onto a road, an apron, a car park, any area and say, right, let's do a GRF assessment, let's guess the depth and then measure the depth. And actually have a go at experiencing it. You don't have to be on a runway, you can do it somewhere else and then do some measurements and actually see how accurate your assessment was. But you can practice yourselves in local conditions.
Excellent, thank you very much. Well, to my panelists and to all of the participants who we have listening to us, we've come to the end of this session. We're actually 3 minutes over time, but it's been very fruitful, very good inputs from all of you. I'd like to thank you again for providing us with these insights. A few key takeaways I'd say are once you've done the training, make sure you go out and practice. Make sure there's some dry runs which are conducted. There are tools which are available for communication from the runway directly up to ATC. Those need to be implemented and managed in an adequate way, if possible. Otherwise, manual methodologies, of course, exist. I'd say for me, probably the key one is the know your runway, which we said. Make sure that staff who are going to be out there are familiar with the environment and able to report adequately the conditions which they identify. So again, thank you very much for your participation. I have on the screen, in principle, you should be able to see a contact email address, safety@aci.aero. If you have any follow-up questions or any elements you would like to clarify from an airport's perspective, we'd be happy to take those on. We've captured a huge amount of questions in the chat today, and we'll be looking at that to tie into some of the guidance material that we're currently developing. So I'd like to close the session here. Again, thank you for your participation. Thank you to all of our audience for spending an hour with us. And I wish you all a great rest of the day. Stay safe, stay well, and let's go ahead and implement GRF. Take care, everybody.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care, guys.